In the grand halls of Windsor Castle, where secrets whisper through ancient stone walls, and every footstep echoes with centuries of history, there lived a young prince who would one day become king. But before George Alexander Louis could wear the crown, before he could understand the weight of royal duty, there was a man who watched over him from the shadows, a guardian whose existence was known to only a select few, whose mission was more dangerous than any battlefield, and whose loyalty would be tested in ways no training could prepare him for. This is not a fairy tale. This is not a story of knights in shining armor or dragons to be slayed. This is the true account of Detective Inspector Marcus Henley, a man tasked with the most critical assignment of his career, protecting a future king while remaining completely invisible to the world. For 3 years, from George's 10th birthday until the day before he turned 13, Marcus lived a double life so convincing that even George's closest friends never suspected that the friendly maintenance worker who fixed broken windows, the substitute teacher who occasionally appeared in his classes, and the quiet man who sat reading newspapers in nearby cafes were all the same person. What you're about to read will challenge everything you think you know about royal security, about the price of protecting those destined to rule, and about the extraordinary lengths to which ordinary people will go to serve something greater than themselves. This is a story of sacrifice hidden in plain sight, of a friendship that could never be acknowledged, and of the moment when a secret guardian's greatest fear became reality, not from an assassin's bullet or a terrorist's bomb, but from something far more dangerous, a young prince who was beginning to ask questions. The royal family's official records will never mention Marcus Henley's name. The newspapers never wrote about his sleepless nights or his constant vigilance. History books will not record his sacrifices. But in the quiet moments before sleep, in the space between what is known and what must remain secret, there exists this story, a testament to the invisible heroes who shaped the lives of those who will one day shape the world. Welcome to the true story of the Silent Guardian. Detective Inspector Marcus Henley had always believed that the most dangerous assignments were the ones that looked perfectly safe. Standing in the pristine corridors of Kensington Palace on a crisp October morning in 2023, watching 10-year-old Prince George laugh with his younger siblings, Marcus felt that familiar knot of responsibility settle in his stomach. He had been chosen for something unprecedented in the history of royal protection, a mission so secret that only 5 people in the entire British government knew of its existence. The briefing had taken place 3 weeks earlier in a windowless room beneath Scotland Yard. Commissioner Sarah Walsh had slid a thin file across the polished table, her expression grave. "What you're about to learn, Inspector Henley, cannot leave this room. Not ever. Not even after you retire. Not even after you die. Oh, Wes. Do you understand?" Marcus had nodded, though he couldn't have imagined what was coming next. Inside the file was a threat assessment that made his blood run cold, not because of what it contained, but because of what it represented. Intelligence services had identified a new kind of danger to the royal family, one that traditional security measures couldn't address. A sophisticated network of individuals who had spent years studying the patterns of royal protection, learning the rhythms of palace life, identifying the tiny gaps that existed in even the most comprehensive security systems. "They're patient," Walsh had explained, her finger tracing the surveillance photos of ordinary-looking people in ordinary places. A woman shopping in Harrods, a man walking his dog in Hyde Park, a teenager taking selfies outside Buckingham Palace. Some of them have been watching for over 5 years. They know which routes the family takes to school, which cafes the children prefer, which friends they visit most often. They've turned observation into an art form. But the most chilling discovery was their focus. While traditional threats typically targeted the most prominent members of the royal family, this network had identified Prince George as their primary interest. As the future king, he represented something they wanted to either eliminate or control. The intelligence suggested they were planning something for his 13th birthday, a symbolic age when he would begin to take on more public responsibilities and would become significantly harder to reach. "We need someone inside," Walsh had continued. "Not alongside the existing security detail. They'll spot anything obvious. We need someone who can be everywhere and nowhere, who can see threats coming before they even form. We need a ghost. That ghost, it turned out, was Marcus Henley. At 38, he was young enough to blend into various backgrounds, but experienced enough to recognize danger in all its forms. He had spent 15 years in undercover work, becoming experts at being ordinary, at being invisible, at being exactly what any given situation required him to be. But this assignment would push those skills beyond anything he had ever attempted. The transformation began immediately. Marcus underwent 6 weeks of intensive training that went far beyond traditional police work. He learned about child psychology so he could understand how George thought and what might seem suspicious to a bright 10-year-old. He studied royal protocol, family history, and the intricate web of relationships that surrounded the young prince. He learned to drive 17 different types of vehicles, from delivery vans to luxury cars, so he could maintain his cover regardless of where George might go. He even took a crash course in plumbing, electrical work, and general maintenance, skills that would prove invaluable in the months to come. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus learned to think like George. He studied hours of video footage, read reports from teachers and tutors, and gradually built a comprehensive understanding of the prince's personality, interests, and habits. George was curious, sometimes to a fault. He noticed things that other children missed. He asked questions that adults often couldn't answer. He had a particular talent for remembering faces and voices, which meant that Marcus would need to be exceptionally careful about maintaining his various identities. The plan was elegantly simple in concept, but extraordinarily complex in execution. Marcus would maintain several different cover identities, cycling through them regularly to avoid detection. He would never be in the same place as George for more than a few hours at a time, and never in the same identity more than once in any given week. The existing security detail would continue their work, completely unaware of his presence. Even George's parents, Prince William and Catherine, knew only that additional security measures had been implemented. They had no idea that a single man was shadow protecting their son across multiple identities. The first identity Marcus established was that of David Morrison, a maintenance worker employed by the company that serviced several buildings in areas where George frequently went. David was quiet, reliable, and utterly forgettable. Exactly the kind of person who could spend hours in a building without anyone paying him particular attention. Marcus spent weeks perfecting David's backstory, complete with a modest flat in South London, an aging van filled with legitimate tools, and a work history that would withstand casual scrutiny. On George's 10th birthday, October 22, 2023, Operation Silent Guardian officially began. Marcus watched from across the street as the young prince emerged from Kensington Palace, flanked by his usual security detail, heading to a private birthday celebration. George was laughing at something his sister Charlotte had said, completely oblivious to the fact that his world had just gained an invisible protector. The first few weeks were a careful dance of observation and positioning. Marcus learned the rhythms of George's life with scientific precision. Mondays and Wednesdays, George attended additional tutoring sessions in a converted classroom at Kensington Palace. Tuesday afternoons were reserved for private music lessons in a studio near Hyde Park. Thursdays often involved visits to friends' homes in exclusive neighborhoods across London. Fridays were family time, usually spent at various royal residences outside the city. Marcus created detailed maps of every location, identifying potential threats, escape routes, and observation points. He noted which security cameras covered which angles, where blind spots existed, and how long it took emergency services to respond to various addresses. More importantly, he began to understand the invisible patterns that governed George's life, the ways that schedules could be predicted, the habits that created vulnerabilities, the small routines that someone with bad intentions might exploit. The breakthrough came during the 3rd week of November. Marcus was working as David Morrison, repairing a heating system in a building adjacent to George's music studio, when he noticed something that made his blood freeze. A woman sitting in a parked car across the street, holding what appeared to be a coffee and a newspaper, but her eyes never left the building where George was taking his lesson. She was approximately 30 years old, with dark hair and professional attire that was just slightly too formal for someone simply killing time in a car. Marcus made note of the license plate and continued his work, but he positioned himself at a window where he could maintain surveillance. When George emerged from the building 45 minutes later, the woman started her car, but didn't immediately drive away. Instead, She waited until George's vehicle was 3 blocks away before pulling into traffic and following at a careful distance. That evening, Marcus ran the license plate through every database available to him. The car was registered to Emma Richardson, a freelance journalist with no criminal record and no obvious connections to any threat groups. But when Marcus dug deeper, he found something interesting. Emma Richardson had requested media credentials for 3 royal events in the past 6 months. Events that George had attended. Each request had been denied, but the applications themselves showed an unusual level of detailed knowledge about royal schedules and security procedures. Over the next several days, Marcus maintained surveillance on Emma Richardson while continuing to protect George through his various identities. He discovered that she was conducting what appeared to be academic research on royal protection protocols, but her methods were far more sophisticated than any legitimate journalist would employ. She had photographed the license plates of vehicles used by George's security detail. She had timed their routes down to the minute. She had even obtained building blueprints for several locations that George visited regularly. The revelation was both thrilling and terrifying for Marcus. He had identified a genuine threat, which validated the entire operation. But he had also realized how sophisticated and patient these threats could be. Emma Richardson wasn't planning anything immediate. She was gathering intelligence for something bigger, something that might not happen for months or even years. Marcus's training kicked in. He couldn't simply have Emma arrested because that would alert the rest of the network that they had been discovered. Instead, he needed to feed her false information while continuing to gather intelligence about her connections. This required an even more delicate approach to his cover identities. As David Morrison, Marcus began to leave small clues that would suggest George's schedule was different than it actually was. A work order left visible on his van's dashboard suggesting maintenance would be needed at a building George had never visited. A casual conversation with another worker where Marcus mentioned seeing important-looking cars at locations where no royal visits were planned. Nothing obvious, nothing that would seem like deliberate misinformation, but enough to slowly corrupt the intelligence that Emma was gathering. Meanwhile, Marcus developed a new identity specifically designed to get closer to Emma's operation. Thomas Parker was a freelance photographer who specialized in architectural photography. The perfect cover for someone who might legitimately need to spend time near the same buildings that interested someone conducting surveillance on the royal family. Thomas was gregarious, where David was quiet, artistic, where David was practical, and most importantly, Thomas was exactly the kind of person who might naturally cross paths with a freelance journalist. The complexity of maintaining multiple identities while conducting active counter-surveillance was exhausting. Marcus had to ensure that David Morrison's work schedule never conflicted with Thomas Parker's photography assignments, while also maintaining his primary mission of protecting George. He found himself changing clothes in parking garages, altering his appearance in public restrooms, and having conversations with himself to practice different accents and speech patterns. But the most challenging aspect wasn't the logistics, it was the isolation. Marcus couldn't discuss his work with anyone, couldn't seek advice or support, couldn't even acknowledge to his closest friends that anything in his life had changed. He maintained his ordinary flat, paid his ordinary bills, and attended the occasional social gathering, all while living a secret life that consumed nearly every waking hour. By December, Marcus had confirmed that Emma Richardson was part of a larger network. Through careful observation and occasional accidental encounters as Thomas Parker, he learned that she was reporting to someone else, someone who provided her with specific questions to research and particular details to verify. She was just one node in a much more sophisticated operation. The network's patience was remarkable and terrifying. They weren't planning anything for George's 10th birthday or his 11th. They were building towards something much more significant, his 13th birthday, when he would begin to take on more public responsibilities and would become a more prominent figure in the royal family. They were willing to invest years in preparation for whatever they were planning. As Christmas approached, Marcus realized that his mission was far more complex than anyone had anticipated. He wasn't just protecting a young prince from immediate threats. He was unraveling a conspiracy that had been years in the making, and he was doing it while remaining completely invisible to the very people he was protecting, maintaining a level of secrecy that sometimes made him question his own identity. On Christmas Eve, As Marcus watched George participate in the traditional royal Christmas Eve service at Sandringham, he felt the full weight of his responsibility. The young prince looked so normal, so genuinely happy and carefree, completely unaware that somewhere in the crowd of well-wishers and photographers, hostile eyes were watching, taking notes, planning something that wouldn't come to fruition for more than 2 years. Marcus touched the small communication device hidden in his coat pocket, knowing that he was George's only protection against threats that the official security detail couldn't even see. In the months to come, he would need to become even more invisible, even more careful, and even more dedicated to a mission that might very well define the future of the British monarchy. The Silent Guardian's work was just beginning. The new year brought fresh challenges that tested every aspect of Marcus Henley's carefully constructed double life. By January 2024, he had been operating under multiple identities for 3 months, and the strain was beginning to show in ways he hadn't anticipated. More concerning, however, was the evolution of the threat he was monitoring. Emma Richardson had been joined by 2 others, a man who appeared to be conducting financial research on companies that provided services to the royal household, and a woman who had taken a part-time job at a catering company that occasionally worked royal events. The network was expanding, becoming more sophisticated, and Marcus found himself stretched thinner than ever as he worked to monitor all 3 while maintaining his protection of George. The breakthrough came on a gray February morning when Marcus, working as David Morrison, was replacing windows in a building that housed several businesses near one of George's favorite tutoring centers. As he worked, he noticed the man from the network, who had identified himself in overheard conversations as James Crawford, sitting in a nearby cafe with what appeared to be building schematics spread across his table. Marcus positioned himself carefully at the window he was installing, using the reflective properties of the glass to observe Crawford without being detected. The documents on the table were architectural plans, but not for any building that George regularly visited. Instead, they appeared to be for a complex that was still under construction, a new educational facility that wouldn't be completed until late 2025. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. The network wasn't just planning something for George's 13th birthday. They were planning something for after his 13th birthday, something that would take place in a location that didn't even exist yet. Their patience and long-term thinking were beyond anything he had encountered in 15 years of police work. That afternoon, Marcus initiated one of the most dangerous aspects of his mission. Using his Thomas Parker identity, he approached James Crawford at the same cafe, pretending to be interested in the architectural drawings from a photographer's perspective. Crawford was initially suspicious, but Thomas's enthusiastic discussion of lighting angles and structural photography gradually put him at ease. "It's an interesting project," Crawford said, rolling up the plans. Educational facility. Very exclusive, very private. The kind of place where important people might send their children. Marcus felt his heart rate increase, but Thomas Parker simply nodded with artistic interest. "Sounds like it could make for some beautiful photographs when it's completed. Any idea when that might be?" "Late next year, I believe. October or November 2025. The timing was perfect, just after George's 13th birthday." Marcus spent the rest of the conversation gathering as much information as possible while maintaining his photographer's cover. Learning that the facility was being designed with state-of-the-art security systems, but also with several features that could be exploited by someone with detailed knowledge of its construction. Over the following weeks, Marcus developed an increasingly complex web of surveillance and counter-surveillance activities. As David Morrison, he worked to maintain his cover while positioning himself to observe the network's activities. As Thomas Parker, he gradually built a relationship with James Crawford that allowed him to gather intelligence about the network's plans. And through both identities, he maintained his primary mission of protecting George, who remained completely oblivious to the intricate cat-and-mouse game being played around him. The most challenging aspect of the operation became managing the emotional toll of his double life. Marcus found himself developing a genuine affection for George, who was bright, curious, and remarkably thoughtful for his age. During his surveillance, Marcus witnessed moments of ordinary childhood. George struggling with mathematics homework, laughing with his siblings, showing kindness to palace staff. That made the abstract concept of protecting the future king intensely personal. But Marcus could never acknowledge these feelings, could never let down his guard, could never allow himself to forget that every interaction, every observation, every moment of George's life might contain the key to preventing a threat that was still years away from materializing. In March, the network added a fourth member, a young man named Alex Chen, who appeared to be conducting research on transportation patterns around London. Alex was different from the others. He was more technically sophisticated, more security conscious, and significantly more difficult for Marcus to observe without detection. The addition of Alex suggested that the network was moving into a new phase of preparation. Marcus realized he needed help, but the parameters of his mission meant he couldn't seek assistance through normal channels. Instead, he developed a careful system of anonymous intelligence sharing, feeding information to various law enforcement databases without revealing his identity or mission. He created fictional personas who reported suspicious activities, leaving digital trails that other investigators might eventually follow without ever connecting them to Operation Silent Guardian. The breakthrough came in April, during what appeared to be a routine surveillance operation. Marcus was working as David Morrison, conducting legitimate maintenance work in a building near one of George's regular destinations, when he observed all four members of the network meeting together for the first time. They were using a small conference room in a business center, believing themselves to be unobserved. Marcus made a decision that went against every protocol he had been taught. Using equipment he had obtained through unofficial channels, he attempted to record their conversation. The risk was enormous. If he was detected, it would blow his cover and potentially expose Operation Silent Guardian. But the potential intelligence value was too great to ignore. The conversation he recorded changed everything. The network wasn't just gathering intelligence about George. They were planning what they called the transition. From the fragments Marcus was able to capture, it appeared they intended to kidnap George during a planned event at the new educational facility, but not for ransom or political purposes. Instead, they wanted to redirect his education and influence his development during what they saw as a critical period before he took on more significant royal responsibilities. The plan was sophisticated beyond anything Marcus had imagined. They intended to take George during what would appear to be a routine security exercise, replace him with someone of similar appearance, and keep him in a controlled environment where they could influence his political and social development. The real George would be returned after several months, but he would have been subjected to what amounted to intensive psychological conditioning designed to make him more sympathetic to their political agenda. Marcus spent 3 sleepless nights analyzing the implications of what he had learned. This wasn't a traditional kidnapping plot that could be thwarted through conventional security measures. It was a long-term psychological operation that required an understanding of child development, political indoctrination, and royal protocol that suggested the network had support from individuals with significant expertise and resources. More troubling, the plan's sophistication suggested that the 4 individuals he had identified were only the operational level of a much larger organization. Someone with extensive knowledge of royal security procedures, child psychology, and political strategy was directing their activities. Someone who understood that the most effective way to influence the future of the British monarchy wasn't to eliminate the future king, but to shape his thinking during his most impressionable years. Marcus faced a dilemma that his training hadn't prepared him for. The traditional response would be to immediately alert his superiors and recommend the arrest of the 4 network members he had identified. But doing so would likely alert the larger organization to the fact that their operation had been compromised, potentially causing them to accelerate their timeline or simply disappear and resurface years later with a different approach. Instead, Marcus made the decision to continue his surveillance while beginning to build a case that would allow law enforcement to dismantle the entire network when the time was right. This required him to walk an increasingly thin line between gathering intelligence and preventing immediate threats to George. The spring and summer of 2024 became a masterclass in patience and deception. Marcus expanded his network of cover identities, adding a bicycle courier who could move quickly through London traffic, a substitute teacher who could gain access to educational environments, and a freelance IT consultant who could legitimately be present in buildings with sophisticated security systems. Each identity required its own backstory, its own set of credentials, and its own pattern of behavior that would withstand scrutiny. Marcus found himself maintaining 6 different bank accounts, 3 different apartments, and an intricate web of social media profiles that supported his various personas. The cognitive load of keeping all these details straight while conducting active intelligence operations was exhausting. But the most challenging aspect remained the isolation. Marcus couldn't share the burden of what he was learning with anyone. He couldn't seek advice about how to handle the psychological pressure of knowing that a child he had grown to care about was the target of such a sophisticated threat. He couldn't even acknowledge to himself how much the mission was changing him. By George's 11th birthday in October 2024, Marcus had documented evidence of the network's activities that painted a picture of an organization with resources, patience, and sophistication that went far beyond anything in his experience. They had infiltrated businesses that provided services to the royal household. They had developed detailed psychological profiles of George and his family members. They had even identified potential weaknesses in the security protocols of institutions that George might attend in the future. Most concerning, they had begun to demonstrate an understanding of Operation Silent Guardian itself. Not the specifics. Marcus was confident that his cover identities remained secure, but a general awareness that royal security had been enhanced in ways that weren't publicly visible. Their plans were evolving to account for the possibility of additional protection that they couldn't see. The cat-and-mouse game was becoming increasingly sophisticated on both sides. Marcus found himself not just protecting George from the network, but protecting Operation Silent Guardian from the network's attempts to detect enhanced security measures. He was essentially running a counterintelligence operation while maintaining multiple cover identities while providing close protection for a future king who couldn't know he was being protected. As winter approached, Marcus received intelligence that suggested the network was preparing to escalate their timeline. The new educational facility was ahead of schedule and might be ready for occupancy by summer 2025, rather than late in the year. If George were to visit the facility during its opening period, it might provide the network with an opportunity they hadn't originally planned for. Marcus realized that Operation Silent Guardian was approaching a critical phase. The network was moving from intelligence gathering to operational preparation, and George was getting older, more independent, and more likely to notice the subtle signs of enhanced protection. The careful balance that had allowed Marcus to remain invisible for more than a year was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. On a cold December evening, as Marcus watched George participate in another royal Christmas event, he made a decision that would define the final phase of his mission. He would need to transition from passive surveillance to active disruption of the network's plans, but he would have to do so in a way that protected both George and the larger investigation that was slowly building around the organization behind the network. The Silent Guardian was about to become significantly less silent. The winter of 2024 marked a dangerous shift in Operation Silent Guardian. As George approached his 12th birthday, Marcus Henley found himself walking an increasingly precarious tightrope between maintaining his cover and actively disrupting a conspiracy that was growing more sophisticated by the week. The network had expanded again, but this time the new members were different. Instead of the careful observers and researchers who had characterized the group's earlier activities, Marcus began identifying individuals with operational capabilities, people with military backgrounds, technical specialists, and what appeared to be a psychological expert who had begun conducting detailed research on educational methodologies for gifted children. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The network was moving from intelligence gathering to operational preparation, and their activities suggested they were confident enough in their planning to begin acquiring the resources and expertise they would need for their transition operation. Marcus faced a crisis that his training hadn't fully prepared him for. Every instinct told him to alert his superiors and recommend immediate action to dismantle the network. But doing so would almost certainly alert the larger organization to the fact that their operation had been compromised, potentially causing them to either accelerate their timeline or simply disappear and reorganize elsewhere. More troubling, Marcus had begun to suspect that the network had some level of awareness of enhanced security around George. Not specific knowledge of Operation Silent Guardian, but a general understanding that royal protection had been quietly increased in ways that weren't publicly visible. Their conversations, which he continued to monitor whenever possible, included references to additional variables and enhanced complications that suggested they were planning for security measures beyond the standard royal protection detail. The breakthrough came in January 2025 when Marcus discovered that the network was conducting what they called proximity testing. Using his Thomas Parker identity, he had maintained his relationship with James Crawford, gradually learning that the group was systematically testing how close they could get to George during various activities without triggering obvious security responses. These tests were brilliantly designed. A woman would accidentally drop something near George during a public appearance, measuring how quickly security responded and from which directions. A man would ask for directions while George was walking between buildings, timing how long it took for protective personnel to intervene. A photographer would take pictures from various angles and distances, documenting exactly where the lines of protection were drawn. Each test was innocent enough in isolation to avoid raising suspicions, but collectively they were building a detailed map of exactly how George was protected during different types of activities. More concerning, the tests suggested that the network had identified patterns in the protection that could be exploited. Marcus realized that he needed to actively disrupt these tests without revealing his presence. Using his various identities, he began conducting his own operations designed to give the network false information about security procedures. As David Morrison, he would accidentally leave work orders visible that suggested security modifications to buildings where no modifications were actually planned. As Thomas Parker, he would casually photograph areas from angles that would make certain security positions appear different than they actually were. But the most effective disruption came through his newest identity, Michael Stevens, a freelance security consultant who specialized in risk assessment for private schools and educational institutions. Michael was professional, knowledgeable, and exactly the kind of person who might legitimately be evaluating security procedures at facilities where important children might be educated. Through the Michael Stevens identity, Marcus began feeding the network's research efforts with subtly false information about security protocols and procedures. He would leave documents suggesting that certain types of surveillance were more sophisticated than they actually were, or that response times were faster than reality. Nothing so obviously false as to raise suspicions, but enough to gradually corrupt the intelligence that the network was gathering. The psychological toll of maintaining 4 active identities while conducting multiple counter-surveillance operations was becoming severe. Marcus found himself having conversations with imaginary people to practice different accents and mannerisms. He would sometimes forget which identity he was supposed to be maintaining, catching himself just in time to avoid potentially catastrophic mistakes. The constant vigilance required to keep his multiple lives separate was exhausting in ways that no training had prepared him for. More troubling was the growing emotional complexity of his relationship with George. After more than a year of surveillance, Marcus had developed genuine affection for the young prince, who was bright, curious, and remarkably thoughtful for his age. But this affection made the mission more difficult, not easier. Marcus found himself wanting to warn George about the threats he faced, wanting to acknowledge their invisible relationship, wanting to be something more than a shadow in the boy's life. These feelings came to a head in March 2025, during an incident that nearly exposed Operation Silent Guardian entirely. Marcus was working as David Morrison, conducting routine maintenance in a building near one of George's regular destinations, when he observed Alex Chen positioning what appeared to be surveillance equipment in a location that would give him direct visual access to George's route. The equipment was sophisticated. A small camera with telephoto capabilities that could record detailed footage while remaining virtually undetectable to casual observation. If Chen was able to complete his installation and activate the device, he would have the ability to monitor George's movements with a level of detail that could be catastrophic for security planning. Marcus faced a decision that would define the rest of his mission. He could maintain his cover and allow the surveillance device to be installed, preserving Operation Silent Guardian but potentially compromising George's safety. Or he could take action to prevent the installation but risk exposing his presence to the network. He chose a middle path that required split-second timing and extraordinary luck. As David Morrison, he accidentally triggered a small electrical problem that required him to shut off power to the entire building. The power interruption lasted only 3 minutes, but it was enough to force Chen to abandon his installation attempt and leave the area before building security began investigating the electrical issue. The incident was successful in preventing the surveillance device installation, but it also marked a turning point in Marcus's mission. Chen's attempt suggested that the network was accelerating their timeline, moving from passive observation to active preparation for their operation. More concerning, the sophistication of the equipment suggested that they had access to resources and expertise that went far beyond what Marcus had initially estimated. Over the following weeks, Marcus documented evidence of the network acquiring additional operational capabilities. They had gained access to vehicles that could be used for transportation during a kidnapping operation. They had identified safe houses where George could be held during their transition program. They had even begun recruiting individuals with expertise in child psychology and educational programming who could implement their planned psychological conditioning. The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear, and it was far larger than anyone had initially imagined. The 4 individuals Marcus had originally identified were part of an organization that included at least 12 operational personnel, multiple safe houses, sophisticated equipment, and enough financial resources to sustain a complex operation for months or years. Most troubling, Marcus had begun to identify evidence that the organization had infiltrated aspects of the legitimate royal protection apparatus itself, not the core security detail. Marcus was confident that George's immediate protectors were trustworthy. But peripheral services and support systems that could provide intelligence about royal schedules, transportation routes, and security procedures. The conspiracy appeared to include individuals within companies that provided catering services for royal events, maintenance services for royal properties, and even transportation services that were occasionally used by the royal family. The network had been systematically placing people in positions where they could gather intelligence about royal activities without raising suspicion. By George's 12th birthday in October 2025, Marcus had assembled evidence of a conspiracy that threatened not just George's safety, but the security of the entire royal family. The organization behind the network had demonstrated patience, resources, and sophistication that suggested they were capable of much more than the transition operation they were planning for George. But Marcus also realized that his window for maintaining his cover was rapidly closing. George was getting older, more observant, and more likely to notice the subtle signs of enhanced protection. The network was becoming more sophisticated in their counter-surveillance techniques. And the psychological strain of maintaining multiple identities for nearly 2 years was beginning to affect Marcus's judgment and effectiveness. The most dangerous development came in November, when Marcus observed evidence that the network had begun conducting surveillance on the surveillance. They were actively trying to identify whether George had protection beyond his visible security detail. Their methods were sophisticated enough that Marcus realized they might eventually detect his presence, regardless of how careful he had been with his cover identities. During one particularly tense week in December, Marcus observed Alex Chen conducting what appeared to be a systematic test of response times and procedures during George's various activities. Chen was using different methods to trigger security responses, then timing and documenting exactly how those responses developed. The tests were designed to identify whether there were protective personnel beyond those who were visible to casual observation. Marcus realized that the network was specifically looking for him, not Marcus Henley personally, but for evidence of the kind of enhanced protection that Operation Silent Guardian represented. They suspected that royal security had been quietly increased, and they were systematically trying to identify how and where that enhancement was deployed. The cat-and-mouse game was reaching a critical point. Marcus was hunting a network that was hunting him while protecting a young prince who remained unaware that either hunt was taking place. The careful balance of surveillance and counter-surveillance that had characterized the first year of the operation was giving way to an increasingly dangerous game of chess, where each side was trying to anticipate and counter the other's moves. As Christmas 2025 approached, Marcus received intelligence that suggested the network was preparing to implement their operation within the next 6 months. The new educational facility would be ready for occupancy by spring 2026, and there were indications that George might visit the facility as part of his increasing royal responsibilities. Marcus realized that Operation Silent Guardian was entering its final phase. The network was moving from preparation to implementation. George was approaching the age where the original threat assessment suggested he would be most vulnerable. and the psychological and operational pressures of maintaining his cover were reaching unsustainable levels. On Christmas Eve, as Marcus watched George participate in the traditional royal Christmas Eve service, he felt the weight of nearly 2.5 years of invisible protection. The young prince looked confident and happy, still completely unaware of the sophisticated threat that surrounded him or the extraordinary measures that had been taken to protect him. Marcus touched the small communication device in his pocket, knowing that the silent phase of his guardianship was nearly over. In the months to come, he would need to transition from passive protection to active intervention, and that transition would likely expose Operation Silent Guardian to the very people it was designed to defeat. The most dangerous phase of his mission was about to begin. The spring of 26 brought Marcus Henley to the most dangerous period of Operation Silent Guardian, as the network's activities shifted from reconnaissance to active operational preparation, and George approached his 13th birthday with an innocence that would soon be forever changed. The transformation in the network's behavior was dramatic and alarming. Throughout March and April, Marcus observed them conducting what could only be described as rehearsals, carefully choreographed exercises that simulated various aspects of their planned operation. They practiced surveillance detection, tested communication equipment, and conducted timing exercises that mapped out precisely how they would execute what they now referred to as the extraction. Most concerning was their growing confidence. The network had evolved from a careful, patient intelligence-gathering operation into what appeared to be a professional kidnapping organization with military-level discipline and planning capabilities. Their meetings became more frequent, their security measures more sophisticated, and their operational preparations more detailed. Marcus realized that his invisible protection of George was no longer sufficient. The network was moving toward implementation with a speed and precision that suggested they were confident in their planning and ready to execute their operation regardless of security complications they might encounter. The time for passive surveillance had passed. Marcus needed to actively disrupt their capabilities while building a case that would allow law enforcement to dismantle the entire organization. The breakthrough came in early May, when Marcus intercepted communications suggesting that the network had identified a specific window for their operation. George was scheduled to visit the new educational facility in early July as part of a carefully orchestrated introduction to institutions he might attend in the future. The visit would involve a small group of students, minimal security presence to maintain an atmosphere of normalcy, and enough time at the facility for the network to implement their extraction plan. The elegance of their strategy was terrifying. During what would appear to be a routine security exercise, something that prestigious educational institutions often conducted to demonstrate their safety measures, the network would simulate a kidnapping scenario that would actually be a real kidnapping. George would be taken during what everyone else believed was just an elaborate drill, giving the network hours or even days before anyone realized that something had gone wrong. Marcus spent several sleepless nights analyzing every aspect of the plan he had uncovered. The network had infiltrated the facility's security planning process, influenced the design of the exercise, and positioned personnel throughout the institution who could ensure that their operation proceeded without interference. They had even arranged for George to be separated from his regular protection detail during specific portions of the visit, creating windows of vulnerability that could be exploited. The sophistication and patient preparation that had characterized the network throughout Marcus's surveillance suggested that this plan had been years in development. Every detail had been carefully considered, every contingency planned for, every potential complication addressed. They had created what appeared to be a perfect operation. But Marcus had one advantage that the network couldn't have anticipated. He knew about their plan while they remained unaware of his existence. After more than 2 years of invisible surveillance, he understood their capabilities, their methods, and their thinking in ways that would allow him to disrupt their operation from the inside. The decision to transition from passive protection to active intervention was the most difficult of Marcus's career. Everything he had learned about undercover operations suggested that maintaining his cover was paramount, that exposure meant mission failure, that the patient accumulation of intelligence was more valuable than dramatic action. But the imminent threat to George forced him to abandon those principles. Marcus began by systematically dismantling the network's operational capabilities while making each disruption appear unrelated to their activities. Using his Michael Stevens identity, he arranged for security reviews at several locations the network had identified as safe houses, resulting in enhanced surveillance that made those locations unusable for their purposes. As Thomas Parker, he documented their surveillance equipment locations and arranged for accidental discoveries that forced them to relocate their observation posts. Most effectively, as David Morrison, he gained access to the new educational facility and subtly sabotaged several elements of the security exercise that the network was planning to exploit. He repositioned surveillance cameras, modified communication systems, and even altered building layouts in small ways that would prevent the network's plan from proceeding as they expected. Each intervention required Marcus to balance disruption against detection. He needed to compromise the network's operation without alerting them to the fact that their activities were being actively countered by someone who understood their plan in detail. The psychological pressure of maintaining this balance, while continuing to protect George through multiple cover identities, pushed Marcus to the limits of his endurance. The most dangerous moment came in early June, when Alex Chen began conducting systematic sweeps for surveillance, specifically looking for evidence of the enhanced protection that he suspected surrounded George. Chen's methods were sophisticated enough that Marcus realized detection was becoming increasingly likely. The careful web of cover identities and operational security that had protected Operation Silent Guardian for over 2 years was beginning to unravel. Marcus made the decision that would define the conclusion of his mission. Rather than risk exposure through continued passive surveillance, he would force the network into a position where they would expose themselves to conventional law enforcement. Using intelligence he had gathered over the past 2.5 years, he began feeding information to various investigative units through carefully constructed anonymous channels. The process was delicate and required extraordinary attention to timing and detail. Marcus couldn't simply dump intelligence on law enforcement agencies, because doing so would raise questions about how the information had been obtained and potentially expose Operation Silent Guardian. Instead, he needed to guide other investigators toward discovering the network through seemingly natural investigative processes. Using a combination of anonymous tips, carefully placed evidence, and subtle manipulations of public records, Marcus created a trail that would lead multiple law enforcement agencies to independently discover different aspects of the network's activities. The beauty of this approach was that it would appear as though the network had been detected through routine police work, rather than through sophisticated counterintelligence operations. The plan worked almost perfectly. In late June, just 2 weeks before George's scheduled visit to the educational facility, Metropolitan Police received what appeared to be an unrelated tip about suspicious activities at one of the network's safe houses. The subsequent investigation quickly uncovered evidence of the larger conspiracy, leading to simultaneous raids on multiple locations and the arrest of 7 network members. But the operation wasn't completely successful. Emma Richardson, James Crawford, and Alex Chen managed to evade capture, along with what appeared to be the leadership structure that had been directing their activities. The arrests had disrupted the immediate threat to George, but they had also alerted the surviving network members to the fact that their operation had been compromised. Marcus found himself in an unprecedented situation. The immediate threat to George had been neutralized, but the surviving network members represented an ongoing danger that would require continued vigilance. More concerning, the arrests had generated intense media coverage and law enforcement scrutiny that made it impossible for Marcus to continue operating through his established cover identities. Operation Silent Guardian was effectively over, but Marcus's responsibility for George's protection continued. He needed to transition from covert surveillance to a role that would allow him to maintain some level of protective oversight while the surviving network members were still at large. The solution came through a recommendation that Marcus himself had helped orchestrate. In the wake of the revealed conspiracy, Royal security experts recommended that George receive enhanced protective training that would help him recognize and respond to potential threats. Marcus, operating now under his real identity as Detective Inspector Marcus Henley, was selected to provide this training based on his supposed expertise in dealing with sophisticated threat networks. For the first time in nearly 3 years, Marcus was able to interact directly with George as himself rather than through a cover identity. The experience was both rewarding and emotionally complex. George was bright, curious, and remarkably resilient in the face of learning about the sophisticated threat that had surrounded him for years. But he was also naturally suspicious about why he was suddenly receiving such detailed security training, and his questions forced Marcus to carefully navigate between honesty and operational security. "You seem to know a lot about these people," George observed during one training session, studying Marcus with the analytical gaze that had made him such a challenging surveillance target, more than you would just from reading police reports. Marcus felt the weight of nearly 3 years of invisible relationship pressing down on him. He wanted to tell George about the countless hours of protection, about the multiple identities he had maintained, about the extraordinary efforts that had been made to keep him safe while preserving his normal childhood. But the requirements of operational security meant that George could never know the full truth about Operation Silent Guardian. "I've been studying this case for a long time," Marcus replied, which was true enough. "Sometimes when you spend enough time learning about people, you develop insights that go beyond what's written in reports." George nodded, apparently satisfied with the explanation, but Marcus could see that the young prince was processing much more than he was saying. At nearly 13, George was developing the analytical capabilities that would serve him well as a future king. But those same capabilities made him a perceptive observer of the people around him. As summer progressed and George's 13th birthday approached, Marcus gradually transitioned from providing security training to serving as an unofficial security consultant for the young prince's activities. It was a role that allowed him to maintain protective oversight while operating openly rather than through cover identities. The surviving network members remained at large, but their capabilities had been significantly degraded by the arrests and the exposure of their operation. Marcus continued to monitor intelligence channels for signs of their activities, but it appeared that the organization had been forced to abandon their plans and retreat to rebuild their capabilities. On October 22, 2026, George celebrated his 13th birthday, surrounded by family, friends, and a security apparatus that had been quietly revolutionized by the events of the past 3 years. The young prince was now aware of the sophisticated threats that could target him, trained to recognize potential dangers, and protected by security measures that accounted for the lessons learned from Operation Silent Guardian. Marcus watched the celebration from a distance, no longer invisible but also no longer unknown. His role had evolved from silent guardian to acknowledged protector, from shadow to substance, from secret to trusted advisor. The transformation represented both a successful conclusion to his mission and a new beginning in his relationship with the future king he had spent nearly 3 years protecting. But as he observed George interacting with friends and family, Marcus reflected on the costs of the operation that was now officially concluded. He had spent nearly 3 years living multiple lives, sacrificing personal relationships and psychological well-being in service of a mission that few people would ever know had existed. The official records would show only that a terrorist plot had been disrupted through routine police work, with no mention of the extraordinary measures that had actually been required. More importantly, Marcus had to live with the knowledge that George's childhood had been forever changed by the revelation of the sophisticated threats that surrounded him. The young prince could never again experience the innocent normalcy that had characterized his first 12 years. He would grow up with an awareness of danger and a need for vigilance that would shape every aspect of his future development. That evening, as the birthday celebration wound down and the enhanced security measures that now openly surrounded George became visible, Marcus received a private message from Commissioner Walsh. Operation Silent Guardian was officially concluded. The immediate threat had been neutralized, and Marcus was being reassigned to new duties that would allow him to gradually return to a normal life. But as he prepared to leave Kensington Palace for the final time in his role as George's secret protector, Marcus encountered the young prince in a quiet corridor. George looked at him with an expression that suggested he understood far more than he had ever let on. "Thank you," George said simply. "I don't know exactly what you did, but I know it was more than teaching me about security procedures." Marcus felt the emotional weight of nearly 3 years of invisible relationship crystallize in that moment. He had succeeded in his mission to protect George while remaining secret, but he had also formed a bond with the future king that transcended the professional requirements of his assignment. "It was an honor to serve you, Your Highness," Marcus replied. "I hope you never need the training I've provided." George smiled with a wisdom that seemed far beyond his 13 years. "I hope so too. But if I do need it, I'll remember what you taught me." As Marcus walked away from Kensington Palace for the final time as the Silent Guardian, he carried with him the knowledge that he had successfully protected a future king during the most vulnerable period of his development. The network's plan had been thwarted, George had been kept safe, and the monarchy itself had been protected from a threat that could have changed the course of British history. But Marcus also carried the deeper satisfaction of knowing that he had helped prepare George for the challenges he would face as king. The young prince had learned to recognize threats, to trust his protective detail, and to balance awareness of danger with the confidence necessary for public service. These lessons would serve him well in the years to come. Operation Silent Guardian was complete, but its legacy would continue for generations. In the shadows of royal protection, in the careful balance between security and normalcy, and in the quiet professionalism of those who serve without recognition, the spirit of the Silent Guardian would continue to protect those who would one day rule.